The neighborhood was quiet that morning. Birds chirped in the early sun, and a light breeze carried the faint smell of freshly mown grass from the yards nearby. The streets were empty, except for the occasional delivery truck and the soft hum of someone jogging down the sidewalk. Everything seemed peaceful, the kind of calm that made people feel safe in their own homes. But in that peace, tension was about to erupt, and no one suspected it yet. She was known in the neighborhood. Everyone knew her as the woman who always had something to say about rules, regulations, and how other people lived. She didn't just follow the Homeowners Association guidelines, she enforced them, so often in ways that went far beyond what was reasonable. People called her strict, overbearing, and sometimes even aggressive. Some laughed about it in private, while others avoided her entirely, learning the hard way that confrontation was inevitable if she set her sights on you. Today, though, she seemed particularly sharp, almost as if she had been waiting for something or someone to break. The invisible line she imagined ran through the neighborhood. The Jeep had been parked there for only a short while, near the edge of a shared green space. It wasn't in anyone's driveway, and it wasn't blocking anything. But to her, that wasn't enough. It looked wrong, or maybe it just didn't belong where she thought it should. She stepped onto the sidewalk, eyes narrowed, studying the vehicle as though it had personally offended her. The morning sunlight glinted off the windshield, catching her attention as she took deliberate steps toward the driver's side. She had her usual expression, the one that warned anyone in her path that she meant business. Nothing escaped her notice, from the faint tire marks on the grass to the angle at which the Jeep was parked. Every small detail fueled the story she was building in her head. Inside the Jeep, the driver was calm, leaning back in the seat, coffee in hand. He had parked carefully, making sure not to disturb the landscaping or block the way. He wasn't expecting anyone to challenge him, especially not in a neighborhood that prided itself on civility. But as soon as he saw her approaching, he felt the tension in the air, like a storm gathering far away, but moving quickly toward him. He didn't say anything yet, choosing to watch her approach. He had learned over the years that some confrontations didn't need words at first, and sometimes silence could be more powerful than any response. She arrived at the side of the Jeep and leaned slightly toward the window. Her eyes flashed with authority, and her voice rose, sharp and cutting. "Do you know this is a private area? You can't just park here. This is against HOA rules, and I'm telling you, you need to move it immediately." Her tone was accusatory, as if she had caught him red-handed doing something illegal. Neighbors inside their homes paused for a moment, listening. Some peeked through blinds or cracked doors, curious about the commotion, while others shook their heads, familiar with her behavior and expecting a scene. The driver kept his expression neutral. He didn't smile, he didn't raise his voice, he just nodded slowly. There was something in his calmness that made her angrier. She interpreted his quiet demeanor as arrogance or defiance, even though in reality he was simply unshaken by her theatrics. She stepped closer, gesturing toward the Jeep as though physically pointing out its guilt. I said, "Move it. This is private property. You're not allowed to park here. You know the rules," she shouted. Her voice echoed slightly off the houses around them, making the confrontation seem louder than it was. Some of the neighbors came outside, drawn by curiosity. They stayed at a safe distance, not wanting to get involved but needing to witness what was happening. A few whispered to each other, predicting what would happen next. Everyone in the area had stories of her neighbors who had been fined, letters sent, complaints filed for the smallest infractions. But no one had seen her this worked up in the presence of someone who remained completely composed. That alone was unusual. It created a ripple of attention throughout the block. She reached for the door handle, her hands trembling slightly with the mix of excitement and anger. She wanted to assert control physically, to prove that she could enforce the rules no matter who was in the Jeep. She gripped the handle firmly and tried to open the door, ready to confront him directly. "You can't just ignore the rules. I will call the HOA office, and they'll fine you. Tow your vehicle and make sure this doesn't happen again." Her words were fast, urgent, as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The intensity in her voice made it hard to ignore, even for those standing at a distance. Watching the drama unfold like a play they hadn't bought tickets for, the driver finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I understand your concern. I've parked here temporarily and I'm not blocking anything. I'll move soon." His tone was polite, but it lacked the fear or nervousness she expected. That calm response seemed to infuriate her even more. She had prepared for a fight of words, maybe even the chance to assert her power. But this quiet composure was throwing her off balance. People who had seen her confront others knew this was unusual. Normally, her intensity forced compliance immediately, but today, usual tactics were not working. The tension grew thicker. She looked around, almost hoping for support from the neighbors who had stepped outside. A few looked at her, but none of them said anything. Their silence was a subtle message they were observing, waiting to see what would happen next. That made her feel exposed, as if the neighborhood itself were judging her actions. Her eyes flicked back to the Jeep and the driver inside. He was just sitting there, steady, calm, and completely aware of the escalating situation. That was not the response she had anticipated. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control. She straightened, adjusting her posture as though that would make her seem more authoritative. She gestured wildly, pointing at the Jeep and the surrounding area. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You can't just come here and park wherever you want. This is private property and the rules are clear. You're going to be held responsible if you don't move immediately." Her voice had risen again, sharp and commanding. Neighbors stepped back slightly, sensing that she might take her next move physically. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The driver didn't react to her gestures or her volume. He remained seated, composed, coffee still in hand, quietly observing the storm she had created. The juxtaposition of his calmness against her frantic insistence made the scene almost surreal. Passersby who happened to walk down the street stopped to watch. Some pulled out phones, sensing that what they were witnessing might be worth recording. But even as the crowd grew, neither of them moved, creating a strange standoff in the middle of an otherwise quiet morning. She tried one last time to assert control. She leaned further toward the Jeep, her face close to the window now. "Do you hear me? I'm telling you, you're not allowed to do this. I've called the HOA before for smaller violations, and they never hesitate to act. You can't just ignore the rules." Her voice was almost a shout now. Her entire body radiated urgency, impatience, and frustration. Every gesture, every word, was aimed at forcing him to comply. The driver finally responded again. Slowly this time, with deliberate calm. "I understand, ma'am. I will make sure it's not a problem. Thank you for pointing it out." His words were measured, polite, and unassuming, yet they held an authority that she hadn't anticipated. He didn't argue, he didn't snap back, and he didn't show fear. That simple, controlled response created a subtle shift in the air. People watching could feel a tan, unspoken power in his demeanor. Quiet but undeniable. At that moment, she felt her confidence falter. Her usual strategy, which worked on almost everyone else, wasn't working here. The calmness of the driver threw her off balance. She started to second-guess herself for the first time in many confrontations. Something in the Jeep looked different now. There were small details, subtle ones, that she hadn't noticed before: equipment in the front seat, markings on the dashboard, and a certain orderliness that suggested the vehicle wasn't ordinary. She paused, suddenly aware that she might have misjudged the situation entirely. For a moment, she stood frozen, the door handle still in her grip. The neighbors, sensing the change, held their breath. Some exchanged glances, wondering if she had finally met someone who could withstand her authority. The morning sun caught the Jeep at just the right angle, glinting off a small emblem on the dashboard that she hadn't noticed before. Recognition slowly dawned on her. The vehicle was not just any Corrit belonged to law enforcement. Her confidence wavered instantly, replaced by a mix of fear, embarrassment, and panic. The driver, still calm, gave a slight nod, acknowledging her concern without any hostility. That simple gesture was enough to highlight the absurdity of the situation. She had approached the Jeep with authority and aggression, ready to impose consequences, and now realized that she had been mistaken in a way that could have serious implications. The realization hit her hard. Her hands shook slightly as she let go of the door handle, and her face turned red with the heat of sudden embarrassment. Neighbors who had been watching the entire exchange now understood why she had been so aggressive. Some tried to hide their smiles. Others shook their heads. A few quietly whispered about how she had finally met someone who wouldn't cower. It was a rare moment in the neighborhood, a small but striking reminder that unchecked authority can be quickly humbled. She took a step back, muttering apologies under her breath. Though the words barely carried over the morning air, the driver, still composed, simply said, "It's okay. I understand the rules are important here. Just make sure everyone stays safe and respectful." His calm, professional demeanor left no room for argument, and the situation began to deflate naturally. What had started as an aggressive confrontation was now a quiet, awkward moment of recognition. She realized how close she had come to overstepping boundaries that were not hers to enforce. The morning continued. Quietly after that, though the memory of the incident lingered in the air. Neighbors returned to their routines, some chuckling softly, others still whispering about what had just happened. She walked away a little shaken and humbled, carrying with her the clear lesson that authority must always be measured and that assumptions can lead to embarrassment or worse. The Jeep remained where it was for the time being, a silent symbol of calm authority in contrast to her earlier aggression. By the time the sun climbed higher, the neighborhood had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. But for those who had witnessed the scene, it was a morning they would remember. It was a story of confrontation, assumption, and the sudden, humbling realization that sometimes the person you challenge is not who you think they are. The quiet of the morning didn't last long after the initial confrontation. Even though the realization had hit her like a sudden wave, the neighborhood couldn't quite shake the energy that lingered. The few neighbors who had watched from a distance were still standing on their porches, talking in hushed voices as if the air itself had changed. For them, it wasn't just another HOA argument. It was different this time. Everyone knew the woman as someone who thrived on control. Seeing her frozen in uncertainty was almost shocking inside the Jeep. The driver had shifted slightly, adjusting the seat but remaining calm. He wasn't in a hurry, and that calmness seemed to make the tension outside even more obvious. He had just finished a quick coffee, and the steam was still rising from the cup. His eyes scanned the street briefly, noting the neighbors' reactions, but there was no trace of impatience or irritation. He seemed to understand the delicate balance of the moment. The line between confrontation and disaster was thin, and he didn't want to push it further. She took a step back. Still holding onto the edge of the Jeep's door, as if it were a lifeline, her mind was racing. In just a few minutes, everything she thought she knew about power and authority had been shaken. She had confronted someone she assumed would follow the rules out of fear, and instead, she had been met with calm authority and observation. Her own confidence, so steady in the past, was cracking. She realized that every word she had shouted, every gesture she had made, had been unnecessary and potentially dangerous if she had pushed it further. "Look," she said, trying to find her voice again, though it wavered. I just want to make sure the rules are followed. That's all." Her words sounded weaker than she intended. She was grasping for an explanation that might make her look less foolish. But it was clear that the driver was already aware of the situation and wasn't offended. He merely nodded, maintaining his calm demeanor. "It's okay," he said softly. "I understand. I appreciate that you care about the neighborhood. Rules are important." His voice was gentle but firm, and it carried a weight that was hard to ignore. She noticed how effortlessly he maintained control of the situation without aggression, without raising his voice, without making threats. That was something she had rarely encountered, and it made her feel small, though she didn't want to admit it. The neighbors who were watching started to murmur among themselves. Some shook their heads, while others whispered, "Can you believe she did that? And I've never seen her like this." Their curiosity was mixed with a sense of satisfaction, as if the universe had handed her a lesson she couldn't argue with. A few pulled out phones quietly, recording the aftermath. Careful not to intrude, but eager to capture a moment that felt historic in the context of the neighborhood still holding onto the door. She took another step back, trying to regain composure. Her mind was spinning with questions. How had she not recognized the Jeep immediately? What if she had opened the door fully and interfered? The thought made her shiver. She had been so focused on enforcing rules that she hadn't taken a moment to truly observe the vehicle. It had all seemed ordinary at first glance, and that assumption had nearly led her into a situation far beyond her authority. The driver, noticing her hesitation, spoke again. "If it makes you feel better, I can move it to a more obvious spot, somewhere it won't cause concern." His tone was calm and reassuring, offering a solution without reprimanding her for her mistake. The simplicity of the offer was surprising. Instead of confrontation, he was offering understanding, and that only made her feel more self-conscious. She wanted to respond, to assert something, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She nodded quickly, still not entirely trusting herself to speak. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a fluttering anxiety she hadn't felt in years. She looked around and realized that several neighbors were still observing her, some smiling politely, others barely hiding their amusement. The realization that her actions had been public, that she had been humbled in front of the neighborhood, added a new layer to her embarrassment. She could feel the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. It's heavy and uncomfortable. A few minutes passed in silence, with only the soft sounds of morning life around them. Birds chirped, the breeze rustled leaves, and a distant lawnmower hummed in the background. Yet the tension lingered, a subtle reminder of the confrontation that had just occurred. The driver remained calm, sipping from his coffee, completely unhurried. She noticed the small details she had missed before the official markings on the Jeep. The neatly organized interior and the equipment that clearly indicated it was not an ordinary vehicle. Her stomach churned slightly as she realized how wrong she had been, trying to salvage some dignity. She finally spoke again, quieter this time. I didn't mean any harm. Her voice trailed off. She struggled to find a way to explain herself without making it sound worse. The words she had prepared in advance to assert her authority were useless now. The calm, collected presence of the driver had removed the battlefield she had expected to dominate. He smiled faintly, not mockingly, but with a gentle understanding that made her feel even smaller. "I understand," he said again. "You're looking out for your neighborhood. That's commendable." The simplicity of the statement was disarming. She wanted to argue, to justify herself, but the truth was plain. She had overstepped. Her mind started racing, thinking about the potential consequences. What if she had touched the vehicle more aggressively? What if she had called for the HOA to tow it? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She realized how easily her misunderstanding could have escalated into something serious. The calm demeanor of the driver had prevented what could have been a humiliating or legally troubling situation. Neighbors continued to whisper and watch. Their curiosity piqued. Some commented quietly about her behavior, noting how unusual it was to see her humbled. Others speculated about the identity of the Jeep's owner. Recognizing the markings and understanding why she had been caught off guard, the whispers grew, a soft background hum to the tense interaction. As if the neighborhood itself were reacting to the event in real time, she finally let go of the door handle completely, stepping back and allowing herself to take a deep breath. Her hands were slightly trembling, a physical response to the rush of adrenaline and embarrassment. She tried to straighten, attempting to regain some sense of composure, but it felt hollow. The driver had already established control over the situation, not through force, but simply by being calm, professional, and composed. "Thank you for understanding," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her feet, embarrassed by the public nature of the confrontation. She could feel the eyes of the neighbors on her, some sympathetic, some quietly amused. The weight of the moment was heavy, and she realized that she had no choice but to accept it. The driver nodded once more, a simple gesture that ended the immediate tension. "It's okay," he said. "Let's just make sure everything stays safe and in order." His calm presence seemed to anchor the morning, slowly dissipating the earlier tension. She realized that he had never been aggressive, never raised his voice, and never intended to escalate the confrontation. That understanding made her feel a mixture of relief and lingering embarrassment. As she stepped back further, she noticed that the neighbors were beginning to disperse, returning to their routines, but still glancing occasionally. The energy in the street was still different, as if the morning had shifted subtly. She could feel the lesson settling in, heavy and undeniable. The confrontation had been a reminder that assumptions, especially about authority and ownership, could lead to serious mistakes. She tried to regain her composure fully, smoothing her clothing and adjusting her posture. Her mind was racing with self-reflection. She thought about her previous confrontations, about how often she had acted with confidence that bordered on arrogance. This incident had been different. The calm, quiet authority of the driver had highlighted how often she might have misjudged situations in the past. For a few moments, silence reigned. The street felt almost normal again, but the memory of the confrontation lingered like a shadow. She could still feel the heat of embarrassment and the flutter of adrenaline. She realized that today had been a rare moment, a moment where her usual tactics had failed, and she had been forced to confront her own assumptions. The driver finally started the Jeep, carefully checking his surroundings. He moved the vehicle a short distance, parking in a place that was clearly more visible and less likely to cause concern. The movement was deliberate, careful, and calm, reinforcing the sense that he had handled the situation without conflict. She watched, silently acknowledging that he had acted with patience and professionalism she hadn't expected, as the Jeep settled in its new spot. She took a final deep breath, trying to center herself. The neighbors who had watched slowly returned to their routines, some still whispering quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The lesson of the morning had been clear, and she knew she would carry it with her. The encounter had been public, embarrassing, and humbling. But it had also been a lesson in restraint, observation, and the true nature of authority. The morning moved on, birds continuing to chirp, leaves rustling in the wind, and life returning to a sense of normalcy. Yet for her, the memory of the confrontation lingered. She had approached the Jeep with confidence, ready to assert control. She had been met with calm authority that she hadn't anticipated. The embarrassment was real, but so was the lesson, a reminder that assumptions could be dangerous, and respect for boundaries was essential. No matter how confident she felt, by the time the sun was higher in the sky, she had retreated to her home, reflecting quietly on the morning's events. She could still feel the tension in her chest and the heat of embarrassment on her face. The driver, now settled in a safe spot, remained calm and professional, a stark contrast to the whirlwind she had created. It was a morning that neither she nor the neighbors would forget, a lesson in humility, patience, and the quiet power of calm authority. And though she wouldn't admit it out loud, she knew she had learned something important. The next time she saw a vehicle she assumed didn't belong, she would think twice. The lesson had been clear, unforgettable, and delivered in a way that left no room for argument. The morning had settled into a quiet hum again. But the tension that lingered on the street was different now. The neighbors who had witnessed the earlier confrontation were slowly dispersing, but their eyes still flicked toward the Jeep every now and then. It had been moved to a more visible spot, carefully parked, and nothing seemed out of place to the casual observer. Yet there was an unspoken awareness among those watching that something unusual had happened, something that would be remembered in quiet whispers for days to come. Inside the Jeep, the driver sat calmly, sipping the last of his coffee. He had shifted the vehicle just a few feet from where it had been, enough to satisfy the concerns of the neighborhood, but without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and measured. He knew the woman had made assumptions, and he understood the delicate balance that now existed. The situation had the potential to escalate at any moment if handled incorrectly, and he was determined to keep it from doing so. She stood a few feet away, her body still tense from the adrenaline of the earlier confrontation. Her eyes kept darting toward the Jeep, as if expecting something to confirm her worst fears, or perhaps her mistaken assumptions. Her mind was racing. She had confronted someone she thought was just a resident ignoring the rules, and she had been humbled by calmness. That had been one thing, but now there was a lingering suspicion gnawing at her. Something about the Jeep had seemed different. She hadn't been able to identify it before, but now, in the quieter moments, it started to dawn on her that this was no ordinary vehicle. She noticed the small details she had missed earlier. The dashboard was neatly organized, with compartments and devices that looked official. There were small markings on the inside of the windshield, subtle, almost easy to overlook. The interior had a sense of order that spoke of purpose, of a life that was structured around more than just everyday errands. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization began to crystallize in her mind. The Jeep wasn't just any vehicle. It belonged to someone who carried authority, someone with responsibilities far beyond the HOA rules she cherished enforcing. Her gaze shifted to the driver again, trying to read him, to find a clue that might explain her mounting suspicion. He met her eyes briefly, calm, unflinching, and patient, as though he could see the storm of thoughts raging behind her eyes. The calmness was unnerving, more unnerving than his polite words earlier. It made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't felt before. She realized that in her eagerness to assert control, she had completely misjudged the situation. Her assumptions had led her into a position where any further action could have serious consequences. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The few neighbors still lingering on their porches and in driveways sensed the shift in her demeanor. Some exchanged knowing glances, quietly whispering about the change in her behavior. The overbearing confidence she usually carried was gone. In its place was hesitation, uncertainty, and a flicker of fear. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But those who had seen her assert herself countless times could recognize it instantly. She was realizing piece by piece that the Jeep wasn't ordinary, and she had made a mistake that could not easily be undone. She took a step closer to the Jeep, compelled by curiosity, but her movements were cautious now. Every instinct screamed that she needed to understand what she was dealing with before acting further. She peered through the window more closely, careful not to touch anything. There were papers neatly stacked in the center console, a small radio device clipped near the dashboard, and a badge tucked in a compartment that she hadn't noticed at first glance. Her stomach turned slightly as she realized the unmistakable symbol of law enforcement. Her mind raced. How had she not noticed it before? The Jeep had seemed ordinary at first glance, but in her rush to assert authority, she had overlooked the small but critical details. The realization hit her like a wave. She had physically tried to touch the vehicle. She had threatened consequences. And she had loudly confronted someone who had every right to respond far differently than he had. For a fleeting moment, she imagined the worst-case scenarios: being reprimanded, being questioned by someone in authority, or even facing legal consequences for her assumptions. The heat of embarrassment flooded her face. The driver, sensing the change in her behavior, remained calm. He didn't speak immediately, letting her process the revelation. His eyes held a mixture of patience and quiet authority, conveying that he had no intention of escalating the situation unnecessarily. It was clear that he had seen countless confrontations like this before, but he also understood that this was a learning moment for her. Every gesture, every pause, was intentional, giving her the space to recognize her mistake without forcing the moment into outright humiliation. She swallowed hard, her mind spinning as she tried to compose herself. I didn't realize," she began, but the words felt inadequate. How could she explain the error without sounding foolish? She had approached the Jeep with aggression, had threatened consequences, and had made assumptions that could have caused serious problems. The driver's calm presence only highlighted her misstep. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, heavy and undeniable. The neighbors were beginning to notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. Some whispered, quietly remarking on how different she looked now, how the confident authority she usually carried had dissolved. Others remained silent, observing with curiosity as the scene unfolded. The energy on the street was palpable. What had been a typical neighborhood morning had transformed into something far more significant, a quiet lesson in authority, assumption, and humility. She finally took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The embarrassment and fear were still present, but she forced herself to stand taller, to face the reality of the situation. Her eyes met the driver's again, and she saw nothing but patience and understanding. That calmness was almost infuriating because it left her without any excuse, without a way to redirect the blame. She realized that she had no choice but to accept the situation fully. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice soft and almost trembling. I didn't know. I thought. The words stumbled out, fragmented and inadequate, but they were sincere. The acknowledgement of her mistake was the first step toward regaining some composure. The driver nodded once, a simple gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and reassurance. It's okay, he said calmly. I understand. Mistakes happen. The important thing is that we handle them safely and respectfully. His tone was measured, professional, and completely devoid of judgment. That simple approach disarmed her further, highlighting the contrast between his calm authority and her earlier overreaction. She could feel the weight of her assumptions pressing down, but she also recognized that this was a lesson she wouldn't forget. The street remained quiet, though the energy was different now. The few neighbors who had stayed were still watching, sensing that the situation had shifted dramatically. They could see the subtle changes in her posture, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way her voice had softened. It was rare to see her humbled in this way, and they recognized the significance of the moment. Some of them whispered quietly, noting how the calm presence of the driver had diffused a potentially explosive situation. She stepped back slightly, giving herself space to breathe and process. Her mind was racing, replaying the confrontation and the moment of realization over and over. She thought about the assumptions she had made, the confidence she had carried into the situation, and how quickly it had unraveled. The Jeep was no longer just a vehicle in her eyes. It was a symbol of authority, order, and responsibility. The mistake she had made in assuming it was ordinary now felt almost tangible. A weight pressing down on her conscience, the driver finally broke the silence. If it helps, I can explain what this vehicle is used for, he said gently. You can see why it might have seemed out of place, but it's part of my work. His tone was patient, offering information without condescension. She nodded, too embarrassed to respond immediately, but grateful for the clarity. The acknowledgement that this was official, that the Jeep had a purpose beyond ordinary driving, reinforced the lesson she had learned the hard way. Her eyes lingered on the Jeep, noting details she hadn't seen before. The markings were subtle but unmistakable, and the equipment inside suggested serious responsibility. She realized that her assumptions had been not just incorrect, but potentially dangerous. The thought of what could have happened if she had acted more aggressively sent another shiver through her. She had been lucky that the driver's calm demeanor had prevented escalation. She took another step back, allowing herself to reflect quietly. The embarrassment was still present, but the lesson was becoming clearer. She had overstepped, assumed authority that was not hers, and confronted someone who had every right to respond in a way far less forgiving. The situation had been diffused only because of patience, calmness, and the quiet assertion of true authority. She realized that this was a rare opportunity to understand the limits of her own power and the importance of observation before action. The neighbors who had been watching slowly began to disperse, returning to their routines, but still glancing occasionally. The energy on the street was subdued, but charged with the memory of the confrontation. They had witnessed something unusual, a moment of humility, learning, and recognition of true authority. The quiet whispers that followed carried a mix of amusement, sympathy, and respect for the driver who had handled everything with professionalism. She stood there for a moment longer, absorbing the lesson. Her mind replayed every detail of the morning, from the initial confrontation to the subtle clues she had missed, to the overwhelming calm of the driver. Each moment reinforced the importance of restraint, observation, and humility. She realized that she would never look at the neighborhood, her authority, or anyone's actions in quite the same way again. By the time the Jeep finally moved further down the street to a designated spot, she had begun to regain a semblance of composure. Her hands no longer trembled as much, and her voice had steadied, though a quiet humility lingered. The confrontation had ended, but the memory, the lesson, and the reflection would remain with her for a long time. It was a morning that would be remembered in the neighborhood for years, a story of assumptions, confrontation, and the shocking revelation that authority is not always visible, and that humility is often the most important response in moments of uncertainty. After the morning confrontation, The neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The birds sang, the sun rose higher, and the quiet hum of daily life resumed. But beneath the surface, the energy in the street was different. For anyone who had witnessed the earlier events, it was impossible to ignore. The memory of the confrontation lingered like a shadow, and whispers traveled faster than the morning breeze. It seemed everyone had something to say about what had happened, even if they hadn't been directly involved. Inside her home, she paced back and forth, replaying the morning over and over in her mind. Every detail, from the way she had approached the Jeep to the calm composure of the driver, haunted her. Her hands twisted nervously as she tried to think through what had just happened. She had been confident, forceful, and ready to assert her authority, but that confidence had crumbled in minutes. She could still feel the heat of embarrassment rising. Whenever she remembered the neighbors watching silently, the first consequence hit almost immediately. A few neighbors who had witnessed the event knocked on her door, not to confront her directly but to comment on what they had seen. "You might want to be careful," one neighbor said cautiously. "You don't know who you're dealing with," another added, "that Jeep. It's not what you think. You need to be careful next time." Their words, though polite, carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Even in her own home, she felt the public eye still on her. Observing, judging, and quietly critiquing her actions, her mind raced with questions. What would the HOA think? Would they receive complaints about her behavior? What about the driver? She had assumed she was in a position of authority. But now she knew she wasn't. That thought alone made her stomach twist. She realized that her actions, though well-intentioned in her own mind, could have serious repercussions. A small mistake in judgment could lead to fines, reprimands, or even legal trouble. By mid-morning, the news of the confrontation had quietly spread through the neighborhood. People talked in driveways, on porches, and during their brief interactions while walking dogs or collecting mail. The story wasn't exaggerated, but each retelling added a touch of drama. Her aggressive approach, her sudden realization, and the calm, unflinching demeanor of the driver made the tale captivating. Even those who had no stake in the HOA rules felt invested, eager to discuss the rare moment when she had been humbled. As word spread, she could feel the shift in how people looked at her. Neighbors who usually nodded politely now avoided eye contact or gave a polite but distant greeting. She noticed subtle changes in their tone when they spoke to her, a mixture of caution, curiosity, and quiet judgment. The social dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted in an instant, and she was at the center of it. Exposed in a way she had rarely experienced, her thoughts turned to the HOA office. She knew that if word reached them, there could be formal consequences. Letters, fines, or even a warning could follow. The realization made her nervous. She had always acted as if her position, knowledge of the rules, and assertiveness gave her protection. But now she understood that authority without knowledge could be fragile, and that assumptions could backfire quickly by late morning. A small group of neighbors had gathered near the spot where the Jeep had been moved. Their curiosity had turned into quiet observation, and some of them spoke directly to one another about what had happened. "Did you see her face when she realized?" one whispered, barely containing a smile. "I've never seen her like that before," another added. The murmurs traveled, reaching even those who had not been present. Her reputation for strict enforcement had taken a subtle hit, and the neighborhood was quietly acknowledging it. Inside her home, she tried to distract herself, busying herself with chores and routine tasks. But her mind refused to settle. Every sound outside, every passing neighbor, seemed to trigger a memory of the confrontation. She could see the Jeep in her mind, the calm driver, and the subtle but undeniable signs that she had misjudged the situation entirely. The embarrassment was compounded by the knowledge that the encounter had been witnessed by multiple neighbors, each with their own interpretations and quiet judgments. By early afternoon, the driver returned briefly, checking the Jeep and ensuring it was properly positioned. He did not speak to her directly, but made his presence known through his calm, professional demeanor. She observed from a distance, feeling the weight of her actions press down once again. There was no anger in his movements, only quiet authority. And that authority carried more weight than any words she could have spoken. She realized that she had been confronted not by aggression, by competence and composure. And that realization was both humbling and unnerving.